Hello, everyone. Welcome again to From the Ground Up, a University of Chicago public policy podcast produced here at Harris School of Public Policy. Today, we bring to you a very fresh and interesting episode where we are trying to incorporate a new format to our podcast. So, over here, instead of having a guest, we decided that it would be so interesting to pick a topic that we find extremely relevant and come out with our very own set of understandings and share those insights with you guys. So, in this episode, we would be discussing rare earth minerals and the geopolitics behind it. The reason why we thought that rare earth minerals are relevant at this stage is because there are so many critical applications that of course we would be sharing with you guys through the course of this episode, and also the geopolitics surrounding it is super interesting. So with this, let's just cut to the chase and begin the conversation. So let's kick it off. And with me in the studio is Christian Gaona,
Howdy.
Aridapo Aziz,
It's great to be back.
and Hugo He.
Hey everyone.
All right, so let's just cut to the chase and dive deep into what exactly rare earth minerals are. So, Hugo, can you help us understand what rare earth minerals are and why are they so interestingly called?
Yeah. What make it rare is because of the concentrations, and there's only a few places that have high concentration of rare earth. Because of the limited locations of those high concentration, is also not economically feasible for many places to mine the rare earth. And I think another important thing about rare earth is that there's some elements. A lot of people might think they are rare earth, but they are not in case.
Yeah, I agree with Hugo there. Rare earth materials, the name is kind of interesting. It's not really rare because you can find it almost anywhere, but to be able to extract them and for it to be economically viable, it has to be in large quantities because mining is a process that is like very capital intensive, labor intensive. So not only in extracting, but also in production. So even though it's everywhere, we cannot get it from everywhere. And that's why it is called rare earth materials. There are heavy rare earth materials, there are light rare earth materials. The heavy ones are, considered more valuable than the light ones. If you understand the periodic table, you probably get this a little better, but I'm not a science guy. But yeah, that's the idea of them and, the minerals from the ground.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. The other interesting part that I really liked what was Hugo was saying that in common man's understanding, minerals like lithium and cobalt are something that people tend to make group them as rare earths. But well, we found out that that's not the case. And with this, let's Christian, we were just discussing before the podcast the various application of rare earths, right? From what I understand, increasingly so with adoption of renewable energy, with advancement in technology, increasingly there has been a use of rare earth materials to produce certain goods to support certain innovations. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So ahead of this recording, we were actually Dapo and I were out in Duluth, Minnesota, attending the winter dinner hosted by Better in Our Backyard. So that was really great. But here in Minnesota and in the Midwest, just to further make that distinction and drive it home, copper, nickel are minerals that are primarily mined here in the Midwest or down in Arizona. There is lithium and in other places. And again, for our listeners, these are not, including cobalt and many others, these are not rare earths. These are listed on the critical minerals list, and many countries, including the United States, we produce a critical minerals list which changes every year to which minerals are priority and which are not. In any case, rare earths, we interact with them more often than we know. For example, you guys might be listening to this podcast on your phone or from your laptop, in which case we use rare earths for these consumer end products, or in something that a lot of us don't even recognize, but we like to during these winter months, especially when we're studying here at the University of Chicago, try to sit by a window so that we can, see some light outside. Those windows, in fact, have chemicals or are made with rare earths to have that sheen to block out the light or to reflect so that birds can see them so that they don't hit those windows, like the windows that are here at the Keller Center here at the University of Chicago. So those are a couple like everyday uses to where you might interact with rare earths in your consumer end applications and you just don't know it. Other applications that are more profound are military uses like jets or planes that we might travel on. If you just came back from the holidays, from the winter break, if you were sitting on a plane, likely that had rare earths integrated into the components that the plane was built with, particularly the magnets in those planes. The turbines that spin those have rare earths in them. Same with wind turbines, where we produce our energy to keep our houses warm. Those also have rare earths in them. There are so many different applications. There are healthcare applications or med tech applications, I should say, artificial intelligence, and even quantum technology. All of these different categories of goods that we interact with, all of them have rare earths.
All right. So, from what I understand, with all the military applications, the technological applications, the healthcare, and our day to day applications, it just seems very intuitively that the organizations and the countries that are controlling the supply of this rare earth minerals or are processing it would be holding a lot of power. Yeah, Dapo?
Yeah, I agree with you. As we've explained, this rare materials are in fact rare. And so, a lot of organizations and countries are working very hard to, gain more control over them. And, as Christian explained, they're being used for a long time for things that we use in our everyday lives. But it's kind of different now because we have things like renewable energy, but also AI, where these things are very important, and countries are competing very hard. And I think what we'll see in the next decade is someone who I don't remember who it was, but someone.
Dr. Hudson?
Yeah, Dr. Hudson said this is what is driving geopolitics now, and that will continue for the next decade. We'll continue to see this competition play out very hard, and I'm kind of excited for it.
All right. Another very, very interesting point that I came across was there are so many countries that have rich, rich resource. For instance, China, it has got 44 metric tons of discovered rare earth minerals, potentially mineable rare earth minerals, and they're doing a lot to actually produce it. Whereas on the other hand, there is Vietnam, there's Brazil, there's Russia, there's India, and even Australia to a great extent, where while there is enough potentially available rare earth, mineable rare earth minerals there, the amount of production that the countries are doing is subpar when you compare it with China and compare it with the resource that they have.
Yeah, and the reason is that, China decades ago saw what's going to happen today and invested in making sure that they ramp up their mining within their country, but also taking control of it outside the country. So China does not only dominate in like having a large reserve that it actually extracts from, it also has partnerships even outside of China. And it doesn't only dominate when it comes to extracting these minerals, it dominates in the production of them too, and also even in recycling these minerals.
All right, yeah. I read about it that in 2022 itself, China roughly accounted for 70% of the world's mine product or rare earth minerals production. And even the processing bit that you were saying, I think China dominates in that category as well, even exports. So that's pretty interesting for one country to be placed at such a strong position. It's absolutely crazy.
They're
And
not only the largest exporter,
they're
they're the
yeah,
largest
importer
importer.
as well. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting thought.
So you know what I've been wondering? I've been wondering what were Western countries thinking while China was doing this?
The point that I wanted to make were two. So the first thing is, interestingly enough, I read about it that in 1950s, even before China, I think even before most countries, if not China, they set up a regulatory body within the government to actually exploit rare earth minerals and begin rare earth minerals exploration. But I think over time, the focus of that authority shifted, right, from the rare earth minerals to something else. So that coupled with similar stances was taken by the US, which I think Christian is better equipped to update us on. So I think that and also the capitalization of technological advancement that China has made to actually ensure the increased feasibility of mining these materials is something that is catering to this growth. What do you think, Christian?
So, to answer the first question, I think that, and I keep harping on this, and you guys have probably heard me say this before, and many of our listeners probably know this, is that the United States in the 1970s underwent a change in their environmental policy. And there was a big push, there was a big agenda with the federal government, with activists, in that we exported a large part of our industries, our extractive industries, due to their environmental effects here in the States. And then we sent them overseas to China, which is where they remained for a long time. What China has done is something that I have continuously written about, I'm still writing about, with regard to backwards vertical integration and why they are not only the importer and the exporter, but they are the largest or most influential country on the price of rare earths and how they're being sold, or what they're being sold for, I should say, in the global market. Backwards vertical integration, for our listeners who do not know, is the process of acquiring the supply chain backwards from the consumer end good to the extraction point all the way up at the mine from the ground up, per se.
Yeah, and what actually makes like China really strong in their domination throughout the supply chain, as Kristen has described, is that it makes it extremely hard for any country, no matter how much money you have, to compete with China for many years to come, because China just determines the price. So let's say the EU is trying to do more in producing this rare earth materials. The United States is also trying to work with European countries that have these reserves. But even if they're able to produce them, it's going to come at a premium. It's going to be more costly than what China is able to do. And if the US is trying to compete with producing these things, China is going to, reduce the price in ways that's more expensive for the United States. It just makes it hard for competition to work.
For sure, for sure. However, that hasn't stopped United States industry and its allies from ramping up their attempts to reduce that influence in the rare earth market, whether it's from Australia, India, the United States, Japan. While China does have many of the refining capabilities, but Australia does have the reserves of the rare earths. And so the United States and its allies can leverage that in building its own processes, which, yes, they do take time to build. They could take 7 years, 10 years, but the United States and its allies and other countries are doing what is necessary. And statistically, we have seen that the influence or the importation of rare earths from China, or the reliance on China, has decreased, particularly in the United States. So where we might have seen 90% of rare earths coming from China, we're now down ranging, and you guys have the numbers up here. We look between the upper 70 percentile to the mid 80 percentile.
Yeah, it's also important to mention that the United States and organizations within the United States face a lot of pressure when it comes to ethically getting this rare earth materials and producing them. So even if they come at a premium at the end of the day, I'm not sure if it's possible to compete with China when it comes to pricing in a way that would really remove China's domination. That would take a long time to do. But if people really care about where these resources are coming from, then that might affect organizations' willingness to get it from China instead of the United States, because China is a black box. It's really hard to know, to understand this supply chain, where it's coming from, where it's going. But that's not as true in the United States. So even when it's more expensive, people may still decide to get it from here. And we can disagree.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention. The first thing was, even now, China, like Dapo was saying, that, by the way, we call Adidapo Dapo. If that's something that confuses the listener, that's Adidapo we are referring to. So even now, China has partnerships, so to say, formally or informally, wherein Chinese companies and organizations have partnered with Democratic Republic of Congo, and it controls 70% of the world's cobalt supply. So inherently, that gives China very strategic importance when it comes to a critical mineral, as well as the supported or as well as the ancillary rare earths that is coming out of cobalt and other African countries. We will discuss what the underutilization of rare earths in Africa and the reasons for the same. However, before that, let me just talk about why is it so that the status quo needed to be changed? Because till the 1990s, everybody was very happy with China doing their bidding because China was getting their hands dirty. China was investing in technology and supplying the world with so much minerals. So in 2010, one of the first time when China had curbed shipments of rare earths to Japan was the first time that the world really realized that, oh, this is something that they have to take care of. And in response, in fact, even recently, I was reading a Reuters report wherein China had explicitly banned the export of technology to extract and separate rare earth minerals. Now, this is absolutely critical for mining and production of rare earths, and China is choking, so to say. The Chinese organizations have the potential to choke the supply chain altogether. In response, it is very interesting that the United States of America and the Europe and European countries, they developed something called a multilateral mineral security partnership, wherein a conglomeration of countries are coming together in response to China's domination, and they are trying to mine more, work more together, facilitate more strategic partnerships. In fact, the recent additions to this partnership were India and Italy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that when I was, I think, middle school in China still. It was first about territory disposed between Japan and China on the, I think in Japan it called Senkaku Island, and in China we call it Diaoyu Dao. It was a territory displayed between the two countries, and where China started to use rare earths as a political tools to go against Japan, because there's a lot of car manufacturing, LED display manufacturing in Japan that rely heavily on the import of the rare earth. And I think this is a really good point to mention, because even though China do have a significant amount of power on controlling the input and output of mineral earth and also the price, but also when they started to do something with Japan in 2010, the Western world was started to realize the problem of heavily depending the import from China, and they were started to seek out for other sources for their mineral earth resources.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I think we often talk about conflicts that might come out of competition for rare earth materials as something that might happen in the future because of renewables or AI, but it has happened already. So this is not only like planning for the future; it's also correcting the mistakes of the past.
For sure, for sure. And while, Western countries, the United States, we've been slow to adopt, and I think there were influences of previous economic theories like globalization and exporting these processes. We're at U Chicago. I remember when I first watched Milton's Friedman video on the pencil and the benefit that, the lead comes from somewhere, the wood comes from somewhere, the rubber for the eraser, the metal for the eraser cap, everything comes from a different country, and every different country had a different role to play in the processes to make that pencil. At the time, I think it was like some X amount of cents, maybe like 10 cents. And I think back then that was the economic logic that was driving the policy behind exporting all of these processes and having a lot of them in China, in addition to cheaper labor. But also, what we're seeing now is that China has grown up since then. China now is a very powerful and, I would say, mostly wealthy country that is second only, and that is arguably second only to the United States. In any case, there's a song called Hold On, I'm Coming by Sam and Dave that I really like. And I think that, coming back from Duluth, Minnesota, and seeing all of the policy internationally, domestically, to ramp up production, whether it's the American Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and so on and so forth, and future acts that are likely to come. American industry is ramping up, and where we've ramped up in World War II to support where we've ramped up in World War I. I see the biggest ramp up since then, and arguably some folks say bigger. We are doing that. And these are the negative effects of backwards vertical integration in economic theory. This is what happens when one party, one firm, that firm being China, not to bully China or anything, but that's the conversation that we're having. One organization having control or a large influence over the market, a monopoly, if you will, or an oligopoly, maybe, over this rare earth market and controlling the price. And then everyone else has to abide by that price and is having a hard time to enter the existing market that they control to fight back price control so that we can compete.
Yeah, like I think it's very right because production of rare earths also comes at a cost. Like we were discussing, it comes at an environmental cost. It comes at an economic cost as well. And with countries concentrating on adhering to their climate or carbon reduction commitments, it's going to be very interesting unfolding of events to see as to how things are or how things will go. Even with all those environment concerns, we cannot possibly negate the importance that rare earths hold. So I think increasingly geopolitically, it is a cause of concern. And like Dapo was saying, that Dr. Hudson had mentioned that this in this day and age, it is the energy resources, the rare earth minerals that is driving geopolitics versus the other way around. So that's going to be interesting play. And the entire podcast so far, I think we have been majorly focusing on China, but there are a lot of countries where the rare earths are found and who are doing who are doing a good job actually to ramp up their production and ramp up their capabilities to reduce their international dependence for such resources, especially towards China, because China is presently the biggest player in the among other countries. So, for instance, Vietnam, Brazil, and Russia, they have close to 21 million tons of discovered resources available with them. However, the production that they have managed to do, while subpar, seems somewhere in the ballpark of 400 metric ton for Vietnam, which they ramped in 2021, which they ramped up to impressively to 4,300 metric tons. And I was reading a report which said that Vietnam is actually taking great steps, incentivization, and the government is putting some policies in place, and the government is trying to ramp up the rare earth minerals so that they could be one of the countries who are major producers of the rare earths. India also increasingly is focusing on harnessing the 6.9 million ton of discovered resources that they have with them. But of course, they're doing so by partnering with Australia. They're doing so by partnering with the United States coalition that I mentioned, the Multilateral Mineral Security Partnership. So these are the countries are taking steps. Even the US, while they have 2.3 million metric tons, which may not seem that big a quantity, but considering the overall availability of rare earth mineral across the world, that is a huge part, and they are doing the great part in not only increasingly producing such minerals themselves, but also incentivizing other countries and assisting other countries to increase their production. So with this, I think now it would be prudent to discuss the potential African countries have, or the untapped potential, so to say, the African countries have in this regard. And well, do you think, Dapo, that if African countries are able to harness the potential in a right way, and what steps can they possibly take? What is the situation now? Could they be collectively so, one of the major contenders to the Chinese dominance that we see in the supply chain?
Yeah, so I should start by saying that this topic is way more complicated than we can talk about in the specific episode. And I hope that in another episode, we can, actually talk about geopolitics in Africa specifically, especially with like what is happening in Congo. But on a surface level, what I hope to see in the next years is African leaders coming together and saying, you know, many of these reserves are in our countries and we can come together, put resources together, and not only extract the resources out of the ground, but also process them within Africa. So it's disheartening to see that like the African Union and other African organizations are not doing enough in taking advantage of this opportunity that we have. I always tell people that this is another oil. What are we going to do with it? Also, other than African organizations working together, I think it's important to mention that, for example, we see that there's a new partnership in Morocco where a new production plant is being built there, and we'll see what will come out of that. But that's Morocco working with a British company. So not only are African countries able to work together, but also we hope to see more partnerships between African countries and their allies outside of Africa to produce these rare earth materials within Africa.
Yeah, I think I completely agree because the the potential that the African countries can harness collective by working collectively as a unit presents a great opportunity for them to not only contribute to the world significantly in this regard, but also it gives them a great opportunity to generate a lot of monetary resources for themselves because exports and production of rare earths would also cater to their GDP, to their growth, economically speaking. And you're right. I mean, I also read about there was, I think, a Canadian mine exploration company that was working in some mines in Malawi. So increasingly so, I think the African countries are realizing the potential of strategic partnerships and inviting companies to do so.
Yeah, you're right. And, that reminds me that a lot of people are skeptical about China and Africa. A lot of people are at the same time skeptical about the United States and Western countries in Africa. But again, I see it as an opportunity for African countries to choose between, both sides and see what works best for them. So I don't think like saying, oh, this side is evil, that side is evil, stops us from being able to like use the competition to our advantage.
Yes, I think I completely agree. And I'm happy by the fact that African countries are trying to enter into such strategic partnerships and such strategic collaborations because in turn it's helping them to harness their untapped potential and is bringing in a lot of resources and both financials and otherwise. It is primarily because of this reason that we are hosting our second episode to resources and development in Africa, which is primarily focused on finance. You guys may remember we had hosted an event last quarter which was focused again on analyzing the moving parts of what does it mean when it comes to resources and development, primarily from an African context. And we had a great panel with us. Similarly, we are hosting this a second part to this series, which is to be held in the spring quarter. So yeah, stay tuned. More details to follow. With this, we conclude this episode. And we hope you had a great time listening to this. We had a great time researching about it. Just to wrap things up, in this episode, we discussed what rare earth minerals are. We gave you a flavor of what geopolitically the context looks like when it comes to who's dominating the extraction, who's dominating the supply chain, the counter that the countries are and the countries are making to China's dominance in the supply chain. And interestingly, in the next episode, we'll be extensively talking about what are the applications of the rare earths minerals with respect to a very, very macro lens. We'll be focusing on industries and we'll be telling you how exactly geopolitics is affecting these industries in particular and the measures these industries are taking now to, well, adjust to the changing status quo. All right, then. Take care of yourself and see you soon.